Isaac Hart was with Decred, and he's going to be talking about, actually, it's probably my favorite pillar or aspect of blockchain, which is governance, and it's very much often overlooked. Here you are.
Okay, thank you. Just going to grab the clicker here. I'm not a professional speaker, but I've been working in the blockchain space for a while. I'll do my best to share what I've learned about blockchain and governance with you. So again, I'm Isaac Hart. I'm a volunteer community manager at the Decred project. Decred is not a company. It's an open source ecosystem. You might relate to it with something like Linux or Unix or Oracle. We're building a system. It was shared earlier that we're in the stage of building the plumbing, and we agree with that. Right now we're trying to build an extremely solid foundation in blockchain technology. And so I'm going to try to mix that, the technology piece with governance, and hopefully somehow come up with something interesting. I want to make sure we're on the same page here as far as governance. So I'm defining governance as methods, processes, and relations by which a project is controlled and directed. We can think about that in the corporate world as that system of representations for stakeholders. So you have the vote, you have the board, typically they have policy governance, and then you have your executives who try to execute that strategy. In the decentralized blockchain world, that model is now antiquated by default. We can't use that model and expect to keep up with the way the world is changing. So we're looking at different principles as far as blockchain governance. One of the first principles is decentralized participation. Participation needs to be measurable, and it needs to be in a defined range that is controlled by that project. So that range can't be limited by the technology. One of the major examples where you see that limited by the technology would be with our first major blockchain, Bitcoin. So some of the same groups that are working on this project today originally worked on Bitcoin, and they ran into a problem. There was a small group of centralized developers that had built Bitcoin and owned the keys and had control making changes. So there was a two-stage process. The Bitcoin developers could say, here's the push we want to release, and then the miners could say yes or no. They could veto that. And so that's essentially the governance that you have in Bitcoin. That's still the governance that you have today. Back in 2012, a group came along and they wrote and implemented a better version of Bitcoin. It was written in Golang, which is the more modern programming language. It was better documented. It solved some of the issues that have come up recently as major vulnerabilities within Bitcoin. And the core developers, who were not Golang developers, were extremely resistant to that. And there was no way for other people in the community, myself and many others who were in the Bitcoin community at that time, to voice, hey, we want choice here. We want multiple implementations to be supported. We want this to be released, and we want it to get attention. It did eventually get released. It is in use today. But without decentralized participation, there was no way for that to take center stage. So we also need decentralized verifiability. So what do I mean by that? Well, today, in most blockchain projects, voice is on Twitter. You see a bunch of people, some of them verified people within the community, some of them paid accounts out there making a lot of noise. When you see a big decision come up like, should we raise the blockchain size? Actually, I would say this is a very small decision. It's very unimportant whether we change the blockchain size. But this caused a huge division in the Bitcoin community and created what some people call Bitcoin Cash now today. So out there in the Twitter world, it looked like the community's pretty split. This is like a 50-50 thing. There's people on one side, there's people on the other side. Well, I guess we're going to fork the community. We're going to split this in half. After that happened, what happened is you see actually 90% of the community did not support this increase. The POW miners, most of them did not support this increase. The community mostly didn't move over. And for that reason, you see Bitcoin valued at a much higher number than you see Bitcoin Cash valued. But because there's no decentralized verifiability within that blockchain project, there was no way to know that ahead of time. And so what you've done is fractured the community. You also need decentralized security. So what do I mean by that? When you have a vote, it is extremely important that that vote is tallied accurately, transparently, and securely. And so that means that your voting system needs to be integrated at the same level as the transaction system within your blockchain. It should have that same level of security. It should not be gamifiable. It should not be a system where you can purchase votes. It needs to be a system where the stakeholders within your system are verified and the votes are transparent. All right, this is maybe going to get a little technical. I'm going to skip over most of this for this crowd. I didn't know exactly who I was going to be seeing when I came in here today. This is essentially telling you what I just told you about how POW-based governance works today on most of the major projects, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, every token-based project that's running an ERC-20. It essentially is a centralized development group that says, I want to do this, and then a POW mining group that says okay or no. And you actually don't know whether that answer is going to be okay or no until you propose it. And so that means there really is no way to make those decisions in a truly decentralized manner. So I'm going to go a little bit more into the history here. For those of you who are maybe have not followed the blockchain project for since at least 2010, you might not be aware that there were a lot of great minds that started entering into the blockchain space around that time and came into the same level of resistance within Bitcoin where outside thinking, outside minds were not accepted. Not only is the development thinking within that project fairly rigid, the political thinking is fairly rigid as well, and it became very difficult to enter into that space without any sort of way to measure voice. So around February 2013, a developer who's, I'll just leave with his name as Taco Time, that's how he's known in the internet community. He's also, by the way, the person that came up with the idea of Monero and created the Monero fork. So if you've heard of Monero, that's the same person who sponsored that project. He said, you know what, we need to somehow fix this governance issue. We need to build this from the ground up and design a system that can be governed in a truly decentralized fashion, that's going to allow us to move beyond this antiquated system. And he worked with that same group of developers who had built the superior implementation of Bitcoin that was rejected and started developing this new system. Originally, it was called Memcoin, Peercoin, Memcoin 2, and eventually was launched as Decred. And Decred is an open source platform that allows you to utilize these same governance tools within your project, either on the Decred blockchain itself or in your own blockchain. Because it is a decentralized open source platform, essentially everything within it is free to use, and any of the tools can be copied and replicated from the repositories out on GitHub. So what did this new model look like? Well, consensus governance involves a couple of things, hard fork voting and authoritative updates. So what does that mean? It means that when the developers get together and they come up with an idea, or the community sends an idea in and it's coded for change, and it's a major change to the project, it requires what's called a hard fork. Now, hard fork's gotten a lot of bad press because in a lot of cases, hard fork splits a project. Or, as mentioned earlier, you can fork a project off and create your own token. However, hard fork also just means making a big change. Okay, we'll just leave it at that, making a big change. So developers come in, they want to make a big change. They need a way to push that. They need a way so that no one has veto power. The community has said they wanted it. The developers have created it. No one should have veto power. So that's called authoritative updates. So that's built into the system. The second layer of governance is your Treasury Governance. Now, one thing that happened, you probably have heard of Blockstream. So Blockstream was the second large company to come into the Bitcoin space and take a look at development. Now, they had a different strategy. Instead of coming in with their own team, they gave the Bitcoin developers houses and food and health insurance so that they could keep doing what they're doing, well, at least in theory, so that they could keep doing what they're doing. What that actually also does is buys quite a bit of influence. within the Bitcoin space, when everyone who has the keys is now living under your house and eating your food. So treasury governance is also an important thing. We need to have transparent funding, and we need to have delegated spending. So what do I mean? I mean, the funding has to be coming in a visible way that has nothing to do with what the developers are doing or what the community is choosing to do. Delegated spending means that spending of those funds is also controlled through that same decentralized system of governance that's shared by all the stakeholders. So there's a couple different models to do this. Our decision mathematically was to split this out with these numbers. It could be split out with any numbers you want. If someone wants to get into the mathematics behind why we chose these numbers, I'm happy to go into detail with that with you. The short version is 60% POW mining means that there's supply available for everyone who wants to get involved in the project ongoing. It's not becoming more centralized, which is the problem with a pure POS solution. 30% POS, that's significant incentive for the stakeholders to continue to lock their funds into the voting system, which means you are recruiting a community that's in it for the long haul. A large majority of our community, when they have been in talks, and I'll state this for myself, I have a 10-year vision with my investment into Decred. Most people say something similar to that. We're talking about the long run. We're not worried about whether it's super flashy right now. There is no product. There is no DApp. The market's not at that place. We're not selling anything. We're building technology. 10% is going into the treasury. That means, okay, you probably know how Bitcoin works. Like every block reward, 100% goes to the miners, right? And then they sell it on the exchange, and then all of us can buy it. So this here, 60% is doing that. 30% is going to the faster. Okay. No problem. 30% is going to the people who are voting, and 10% is going into that treasury. So it's 100% self-funded. There's no outside influence, no VCs. This is a model that can easily be replicated. Like I said, this is all open source. You can either use it or borrow it. All right, I guess I'll skip through this. This just shows how it works. These are some other advantages of those numbers that I talked about. You've probably heard about 51% attacks. Essentially, every project that's not on ASICs and isn't Ethereum is extremely vulnerable to 51% attacks right now. If you don't have a large ASIC network and you're not Ethereum, there's a bunch of people out there who are, for fun right now, double spending your money. And that's going to continue to happen. You also get 40% greater efficiency. Green is a buzzword these days, so that's great. It also prevents centralization, like I mentioned. All right, so that's our killer feature, is good governance. And with good governance, you can have any feature you want. I'm quoting there one of our VCs, and I guess we'll go to questions.
Yeah, so we just have time, unfortunately, for one question.
Okay. Yeah.
How do you keep the people with most of the credit from being basically the dictator? How do you solve for that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why we chose this setup mathematically, is working the numbers out. This allowed us to, from the beginning, create a system that's decentralized. So for example, the top 1,000 addresses own 18%. To pass a vote, you need 60% for a funding, 75% for a hard fork decision. So you need a pretty large chunk of the community. You're going to need the VCs. You're going to need the early developers. You're going to need the second round developers. And you're going to need a chunk of the community. Not all of them, but you're going to need some from all of those groups to pass something. Okay. Is that it?
Yeah, you have one more question, I guess.
Great.
So who's going to do it? Because we got to...
Sure.
Could you just explain, this being self-funded and some community funding, what do you get out of it at the end of your 10 years effort?
Sure. Well, I hope that the project is successful. And so there's a financial incentive for me, certainly, for that to be, because I invested some of my own money in the project. The other thing is many of us came from backgrounds like developing on Linux projects, OpenBSD, like I mentioned, some of us Bitcoin projects. So doing the work is actually very fun. When you really believe you're building something that's like for the betterment of mankind, to build a system that can be used in the long run, it means you get a lot more enjoyment out of your work. So that's a piece of it as well. Yeah. Thanks. All right. Thank you.